let me briefly introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Sandra Soo-Jin Lee from Columbia, where she's chief of the Division of Ethics and professor of Medical Humanities and Ethics here at the Columbia University Irving Medical Center. She is a medical anthropologist who's been engaged in a wide range of different topics in bioethics, much of her work focusing on ancestry and equity in genomics.
Great. Thank you so much, Ruth. I'm going to try to share my screen now, and I hope that will be legible to folks. Is that all right?
Yes, it's fine.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. I am really grateful to the organizing committee for the invitation to speak today at this capstone conference for the SEER. It has been a tremendous group of scholars, as you all well know, that have worked together over a decade, and I am delighted to be included in this culminating meeting. My presentation today draws on the study that really does build on the first two presentations in a focus on the ethical issues that emerge for stakeholders of N of 1 individualized therapy. So Allison spoke a bit towards the end of her presentation about the specificities of these type of interventions. And I'm going to be drawing on an exploratory study that has been funded by a supplement from NHGRI to the SEER in 2020 that surfaces some of the issues and perspectives of some of our stakeholders when we talk with them about these types of interventions. This work is in collaboration with several team members, including our PI, Paul Applebaum, Wendy Chung, Josie Johnson, Katie Tabb, Danny Pasia, and Mika Karuncho, who I give a special thanks for helping me put together these slides. So the study builds on the emerging literature on the challenges for parents of children with very rare genetic diseases who must weigh the risks and benefits of untested interventions. These experimental interventions may involve only one individual due to the rarity of the condition, and it forces parents to make decisions about their child's participation without the benefit of human data. So in order to ensure that parents make informed decisions, we know that IRB members are really responsible for overseeing the consent process. And that process should offer transparent and fulsome information. What is less known are the stakeholder perspectives of what constitutes the risks and benefits of such interventions, what information should be included, who should convey it, and how parents interpret the information and make sense of this information within the specific family context in which they function. So I'm going to just briefly describe the two aims of this study. To understand the ethics of these interventions, we really were interested in the perspectives of parents of children with rare genetic disorders, IRB members, and clinical geneticists to help us think through how they thought about the risks and benefits of these approaches and the role of consent in supporting decision-making for participation of these children. You can see here the two aims. The first aim was to interview the three groups of stakeholders. And then the second was to draw on the interview data and the existing literature to develop a map of relevant issues and to propose a conceptual model to understand these challenges. This will, in conjunction, hopefully lay out a research agenda that would provide the information needed to make better decisions and policies for subsequent studies. This presentation is really focused on the first aim of that study. Just to give you a sense of the methods, again, this is exploratory in nature, and so we have a relatively small number of in-depth open-ended interviews that we're drawing on. Participants were recruited through a snowball method of introduction in which we identified individuals who could provide rich data based on their familiarity with N-of-1 studies and protocols. We ended up interviewing 11 parents with children who were diagnosed with rare neurogenetic conditions and who were familiar with N-of-1 gene therapy trials. Our participants also included 9 IRB members from 8 institutions that had engaged in research on rare neurogenetic conditions, and in most cases had some familiarity with N-of-1 trials and related protocols. And then lastly, we have interviewed 8 clinical geneticists from 7 institutions, many of which had familiarity with these type of interventions. You can see here some of the additional demographic information just to give you a sense of this relatively small set of interviews. Participants were contacted by email, and we did about an hour-long interview. The interviews were entirely conducted individually via Zoom by Paul or myself. Interviews were digitally recorded, transcribed verbatim, and qualitatively analyzed through our software package Deduce. We used modified grounded theory to develop 53 codes, and you can see here an example of the types of codes that were generated through the data. And these were analyzed in an iterative fashion, and we identified a number of themes, some of which I will discuss in this presentation. Another note, we used a vignette to facilitate the interviews in order to acclimate folks to the kinds of conditions, the scenario that we wanted them to react to. And so here you can see some of the features of that vignette. What we thought presented a general N-of-1 treatment case study. And you can see here, we've described a young child with a rare genetic condition, rare genetic mutation that would affect the brain and would be associated with intellectual disabilities. We noted that there was a pharmaceutical company involved that would develop a new gene therapy, never before used in humans, a risk of developing cancer and possibly other unknown risks that would not be treatable or reversible. The child would likely be the only one receiving this type of therapy because of the rare mutation, although there might be the possibility of unknown future patients that might get the treatment. The cost of the experimental gene therapy is noted here, in addition to the cost of several years of time and effort by scientists who developed it. So this was the vignette that we presented to all 3 of our stakeholders, the parents, IRB members, and clinical geneticists. In terms of the interview domains, you can see here we really did try to explore 4 different areas that relate to the societal, ethical, regulatory, and conceptual issues that are associated with individualized therapies for these rare genetic disorders. What I'm going to be focusing on today are really the ethical considerations, the risk-benefit calculus, and the way in which parents are making these kinds of decisions, thinking through whether participation of their children should happen. And then this slide is just to give you a sense of how I'll be walking through some of our findings. I'll be speaking a bit about the research versus clinical care boundary and how did our stakeholders think about that. Also the generalizability, this concept very much defining research and notions of future benefit. Some of the dangers that are associated with the blurriness between research and clinical care and that spectrum. And then how did our stakeholders think about the assessment of risks and benefits, in particular with respect to quality of life of the patient, the disease progression of the child, and then the interests of the family. And then finally, some findings around transparency, consent, and the role of neutral parties. So all three stakeholders agreed that N of 1 approaches are both research and care, and that disentangling them is challenging, if not impossible. Reflecting this predominant view, one of our clinical geneticists shared, quote, "I think it's both. I mean, with just the genetics, you have the science and you have the clinical, they're intertwined. There's no separation. So I don't think you can do one without the other at all," end quote. IRB members express similar sentiments and focus on the experimental nature of the interventions. One IRB member who argued against the clear categorization of research or treatment expressed her discomfort with discrete boundaries, saying, quote, "I don't know that I would feel comfortable with saying that it's just clinical and it's not research based on the fact that this is an agent that has never been used in another subject before in another human," end quote. This came through more strongly in this response from an IRB member who says, "Well, I think at this point, I would think of it as clinical research, even though it's an N of 1, that is because the disease is so rare, but we would be trying a new technology that has never been done previously in humans. So it would take a few of these patients to actually someday call it an improvement to clinical practice. I think at this point, it is highly experimental, and there are so many unknowns, it's truly in the realm of research," end quote. Parents also expressed ambivalence and were less clear about the nature of the question, and had difficulty understanding the distinction as reflected in this interview response. "Well, I guess honestly, I still don't really quite understand the whole process of individualized treatment. I mean, I have a very general understanding of it, but what I imagine it means is that you're thinking about giving a treatment to a person based on some understanding of the underlying pathophysiology of the illness. And I guess maybe there's some bench research. I guess you're pulling together certain strands of research or scientific concepts to make some best guess about this thing working in this condition. So, I mean, I don't know if how to think about that. I don't know if you can explain a little bit more about what's involved in developing an individualized therapy exactly." So in trying to just figure out, is it more research? Is it more of a clinical process, a clinical decision? I don't know. Whereas the parents struggle to answer the question of whether interventions fell into the category of research or clinical care, several emphasize that what could be learned from the use of interventions extended beyond the therapeutic impact of an individual child. Parents express this in terms of potential benefit in the form of knowledge. This person says, "But at the same time, sometimes you learn from these studies things that may impact other research as well. Benefits are not just for the patient. I mean, they are for the specific people at the time, but I'm saying there may be other tools or skills or things that are learned from the research that might be helpful." Several parents queried whether there would be tertiary benefits gained, that is beyond whether a particular intervention worked on their child, but the incremental knowledge gained for the next application. This parent says, "Also just in my own head, there's a method by which this therapy is being administered. Can the method be beneficial to other people? So not the actual treatment, right? But I understand maybe it's specifically for that individual person, but is the method by which they're doing it beneficial to a larger group of individuals at some point?" End quote. Parents were even more direct in framing the impact of the N of 1 intervention first used in their particular child as extending to unknown future patients. This parent says, quote, "It's a new modality that needs to be used on my child's mutation. We know under 20 people in the world that have her mutation. So if an N of 1 works for her, it's not going to work for the 300 kids in our community. However, once my child can show proof of concept that it works, then it's clinical care that those other 19 kids get. But that first tip of the sword is clinical research. I guess it is, right? It's because there's no known outcome yet," end quote. IRB members with this agreed with this rendering of the interventions as qualifying as research and underscored the tertiary learnings as rationale for categorizing activities as research. These IRB members strongly suggested this constituted generalizable knowledge. This IRB member says, quote, "The definition of clinical research and human subjects research is really generalizability. And when you're talking about an N of 1, which possibly might turn into an N of 2 or 3, it's hard to call it generalizable to a wider group. But at the same time, they're going to learn about the side effects of giving this particular agent to this particular disorder or disease, if you will. And I would say that it sounds like it would have a research hypothesis, if you will. If we give this gene therapy, then it will be correct to say genetic disorder in theory. I mean, I guess I would constitute it as research because it's an experimental therapy being given to this child." Similar to parents, IRB members understood the research clinical divide as best understood as a spectrum in which N of 1 interventions were on the edge of research. One IRB member said, quote, "I'm definitely saying I don't think this would just be therapy. I think it is the beginning of research if itself is not research," end quote. Similar to the parent earlier who suggested that the interventions on her child was the tip of the sword, IRB members situated N of 1 activities as a catalyst and potentially transformational and critical for the development of effective therapies. One IRB member drew on an analogy of CAR T therapies, quote, "If you think about it, at one point at the outset, CAR T therapy is tailored to an individual patient. We take their cells and you convert them, and then you give them back to them as this CAR T product. At the beginning, children got or adults too, very ill and ended up in the ICU often. And there were people who died from toxicity of the cytokine release syndrome. And then people learned. Now we know how to manage that better. But there were the first participants of CAR T who could have given up. And now people are trying to do similar therapy across all sorts of malignancies, not just T malignancies. So I think that if their study team, the PI at the institution, demonstrated the rationale and that there is the potential for benefit for the individual patient, and then this more nebulous benefit for future patients, I think that would weigh in the plus column for approval," end quote. IRB members felt comfortable designated N of 1 interventions as research, ushering into consideration the potential for adjacent learnings about application and body of knowledge that would be built over time. As such, they invoked a more expansive view of benefit, possible endpoints and outcomes. This IRB member uses the metaphor of a platform being built over time. She says, quote, "I tend to think of with this kind of research that there's generalizable knowledge. I think a lot of what the science is and what's happening right now is there's a platform being developed. And so while this may be incredibly rare, the questions I would ask back to the researcher are how much of this, the basic platform, could be used in other areas. And so trying to understand from an institutional standpoint, are there learnings that could apply even if this is literally a one-case situation? And I think those learnings are not just on the science, but also on the application. And I have to go back to at least the experience I've had thus far with a few cases we've talked about, that trying to understand the functional correction and measure it, at least we've done some cases where we're really trying to learn whether or not it's working, and it may take years. And so building those capabilities into the way these studies get done is also part of that platform. And so I think that there's a lot of generalizable knowledge, but I would ask the investigator to reflect on that and come back with what they see as those elements of generalizable knowledge. I think even the vector, the delivery method, there's elements of that potentially are generalizable, end quote. IRB members argued for a more expansive view of generalizability and to broaden the potential benefit beyond the patient in the protocol, but to unknown future patients. This IRB member explains the need to push the boundary. I think that is something that is always important to us here, to this institution, IRB. And it may be a bias of our institution in some ways, and all of us work here in the sense that this is kind of what we do. We push the boundary. But to me personally, and as a chair or as an IRB member, that has value. And if I had to put it in 2 columns, I would put it in the benefit column, because hopefully we'll benefit this child, but surely it can benefit someone down the road. So I would think that as a benefit, not maybe directly to this patient, but this is going to be a huge jump. It would not be necessarily taken into IRB's consideration, but for some of this rare disease, and even for what we see here, like cancer or a severe sickle cell or aplastic anemias, things like that, there is a sense of community in the parents of these children where they see it as a benefit that another child will get something out of it. So the gray zone of whether N of 1 activities are research or clinical care, and the expansive view of the benefit of such interventions beyond the individual patient, but to the yet unknown learnings that may help unknown future patients, raises questions about proper disclosure through consent. IRB members express concerns about the potential for therapeutic misconception in parents about the impact that the interventions would have on their children. They were particularly worried about the shift from clinical to research and the dangers it presents patients and parents who may not recognize when a set of activities has tipped into research. Here, one IRB member says, quote, "If you don't designate it as research and it turns out to be more systematic than care, systematic in the data collected and things like that, it would be more about, were the parents adequately informed about the experimental nature of it, the intent of it? If it ends up being more investigative rather than treatment, we're really in a regimented way following you in a protocol way. If we're going to end up following you for 10 years and we're going to be collecting all this information above and beyond what the treatment would be like, okay, we're going to have your kid come in for cognitive testing every year or something like that, and it's not part of their care that they would have to do this, but you're doing it because you want to see how the treatment worked or something like that. And that's when it's like, oh, did it evolve into something that is more research than treatment? All of our stakeholders were concerned about the need for transparent, accurate, and fulsome information. As this clinical geneticist notes, I think there's an element that enters into it that has to be considered coerciveness, if you will, a sub rosa coerciveness of knowing that there might be something that works. And so people who are terrifically desperate for something that's going to ultimately be very problematic for their health, I think there's a serious question there as to whether this is really something that is informed consent, or is this like, how do I put it, that they really don't feel they have any other choice but to do it, end quote. However, we found that most of our parents understood the experimental nature of the interventions. This is a quote from one parent who says, you know, quote, "Like I said before, I don't know how many families would be apt to allow their kid to be the guinea pig unless their life depended on it. The circumstances were going to be so grim for them that they were willing to take that chance. If their kid's quality of life was so limited, it is experimental in a sense, but it also is research for the next group or person. I think that's, again, if there's a better model of an animal model to do it, I think that's where you start, but I don't know if there's another way. I mean, an animal is not a human being, and I guess there are so many unforeseen circumstances, and that's how you advance this process, I guess," end quote. When asked about evaluating risks and benefits, parents assess these in terms of quality of life for their child and the trajectory of disease of their disease progression. Quality of life was identified as an important, if not subjective, concept for all our stakeholders, but the parent interviews suggest that there are two main threads that are interconnected in their decision-making on whether to allow their child to participate. There is an emphasis across the board among parents on the intellectual and functional abilities of their children and the weightiness of their assessment on their decision-making. They express frustration of not knowing the quality of life for their own children and the potential risk of death and serious physical harm. And that burden of not knowing what their child is feeling and thinking or the level of pain or suffering that they might be currently experiencing added to the excruciating decision-making about whether or not to go forward with an intervention. Parents emphasized also the decision-making required evaluating the current state of their child's pain and suffering in the context of a projected trajectory of potential degeneration over their child's lifetime. This parent explained, quote, "I know I wouldn't let my son personally be the guinea pig to help other kids, but for instance, if my kid was having grand mal seizures all the time and was immobile and had zero quality of life, I wouldn't hesitate to probably do it," end quote. Another parent reflected a similar assessment, quote, "Like I said before, it comes down to the severity and degenerative nature of the disease. I think if your child has a quality of life, it might not be as high as you'd want it to be. I don't know if the risk is worth it," end quote. Parents agonized over weighing the uncertainties of the impact of the interventions. And we found that parents' risk tolerance was tied to their ability to live with their child's current condition. Parents attempted a calculus of suffering in determining how much pain and suffering can the experimental treatment potentially reduce against how much it would inflict. And this is a quote from another parent, quote, "I feel like what we're trying to weigh is how much pain and suffering can we potentially cause by giving the treatment, and how much pain and suffering could be potentially relieved by giving the treatment if it works. I feel like I'd have to feel like there's a significant amount of pain and suffering that could be relieved by giving the treatment and a very minimal amount of pain and suffering that could be caused by the treatment. There'd have to be enough of a differential between those two. So I guess talking through that kind of balance or something," end quote. For this mother, the bar is high, and the bar is very high, and it would need to clear what she understood as her current child's quality of life. She writes, "I'd rather live the rest of my life with her daughters the way things are. I mean, we love her, we're deeply connected to her, she's everything to us. We're making, as dreadful as it is, we're making the best of it. I don't know how to quantify that bar, but it'd really be a very high bar. But that's our situation, thinking about our daughter. I guess there are other children where they're in chronic pain all the time. They have a lot of medical problems. There's a lot of pain and suffering all the time. I imagine the calculus would be different there," end quote. Parents agreed that their child's quality of life in a world where neurocognitive disabilities might be beyond what they could imagine and make them subjects to lifelong stigma and possibly much worse due to social vulnerabilities. One parent included these into her calculus of enrolling her child into an N-of-1 study, saying that her daughter would be, quote, 6 times more likely to be sexually abused because of her syndrome and not having intellectual impairment, not being nonverbal. We would want for her to be able to access what's actually going on in her brain and be able to speak so she could live a more fulfilled life, end quote. For some parents, protecting their child and optimizing for a better life required they faced the potential for improvement, however untested, would require a decision to participate. And this parent says, "I also think that as parents, if there's an opportunity to help a child, then there is also some level of obligation to do that. So for me, I don't feel like there's much of a choice, but that's a personal thing for me," end quote. And this actually speaks to some of what Allison presented at the end of her presentation. The calculus of suffering described by several parents not only included consideration of the quality of life for their child, but parents spoke about the impact of their decision on the family unit as a whole. In this exchange between two parents, they reflect on these concerns. The mother is saying, "We're so acutely aware of the impact of the child's brother and his sadness, his sense of loss," and the father, "Right, but how would he feel if something went wrong also?" The mother, "He'd feel horrible." Father, "Right, so." The mother, "I think if anything, it would be more momentum to want to get it right because it impacts not just me and the child and all these wonderful instructors who love her, but impacts her family. I wouldn't want to take more risks, but it certainly motivates me to get her better," end quote. Clinical geneticists recognize that parents weighed the risks and benefits of the intervention as complex, multifaceted decisions that extended far beyond the health and well-being of the particular child in question. Here, a clinical geneticist says, quote, "There are a lot of lifestyle issues and possibly changes that occur when having to take care of a child with significant disabilities. It may be that the mom had to give up work or career. If there are siblings, giving adequate time to the siblings, or they may resent the child because of how much time that child encompasses with their care. There may be marital strain. There may be a support system of other caregivers. They may rely on hired help, for example, or whatever help they get because the kid has a G-tube or a tray or whatever. I think the child's position in the family and the siblings, and if not having that child. So if the therapy failed and the child died, how would that play out on the family dynamics? Would the parents get divorced? Is that holding the marriage together? Is it straining the marriage? I think all of these are really important issues," end quote. And yet, while there was widespread recognition, and I would say not just with the clinical geneticists, but our other stakeholders as well, of the cascading impact of caring for a child with severe neurodevelopmental problems, IRB and clinical geneticists, IRB members and clinical geneticists felt strongly that the calculus of suffering should only focus on the interests of the child. I feel, and this is from a clinical geneticist, I feel that the primary focus should be on the child and the child's perspective on life and outcome rather than the family's perspective. The family's perspective, I feel, is important when it comes to like prenatal counseling and the decision of whether or not to terminate a pregnancy. But when the child has been born and is already suffering from the disease, I feel that the primary interest and the primary focus needs to be on the child, end quote. All three stakeholders emphasize the importance of transparent and fulsome information to help parents make decisions about participation. Parents wishing to make the right decision for their children and their families identified a deep desire to understand the science, and their hope for their physicians would make this information accessible. Specifically, they expressed a desire to make decisions about safety and efficacy based on the scientific facts available to them. One parent says, quote, "I would want to read every single piece of data that's been out there. I want to actually understand what the tox studies have been. I want to talk to the scientists. I want to have a team of neurologists who are going to help explain everything that's going on and at a high level and a detailed level," end quote. IRB members and clinical geneticists were particularly attuned to the pressure parents may be feeling in the consent process. And here, one IRB member says, "But when it comes to what you're talking to the family about, that consent should help the researchers illustrate that this is truly a therapy that is unknown. They've tested it in animals, but it has not been used in humans before. And this family is going to be particularly vulnerable to having this be their one and only hope. And so there's probably going to be a tendency to want to basically accept any risk because of the fact that this is basically their one and only hope to have their child have a semi-normal life," end quote. The IRB member goes on to underscore that the, quote, "physician working with this family should stress that, yes, there's a lot of promise for this and explain all the science behind how it was developed, explain that the pharmaceutical company did all the testing. However, stress that even if we do this, it could either cause the condition to stay the same or it could cause all of the other unintended side effects. And they need to be careful about explaining each and every one of those additional risks so that the family can determine for them, is this risk less than what they would perceive to be a possible benefit," end quote. Clinical geneticists were aligned with IRB members and parents around the need for an understanding of the science and a transparent process that would protect them from conflicts of interest. Some suggested that a neutral party was needed to manage potential bias and conflicts of interest. A clinical geneticist shared, "My only desire and need for parents is to make an informed decision, not to make a decision that I think makes the most sense. Sometimes people, when I'm talking to them, they think that they'll be disappointing me by making a decision. They think that that's what I want them to make. And probably there's probably seeing something underneath what I think is a cool and non-committal demeanor. But honestly, my stated goal and my hope is that my counseling to parents is all about having them understand what they need to understand. to make the decision from the disease standpoint and from the treatment standpoint. Another suggests the need for a navigator to usher parents to information without the potential for bias or conflicts of interest. Hopefully, parents will have a good navigator to navigate them to understanding what the science is, and therefore what some of the anticipated or the educated guesses are about benefits and risks to that treatment. The likelihood, I guess, in terms of a severe adverse outcome, they'd want to have some idea of what those might be. And if the answer is they could be anything up to and including a fatal outcome, they should understand that. I think that parents often do things too to help people more broadly, but they should have an understanding that this is being developed only for their daughter, only for their son or daughter, end quote. IRB members spoke about support for parents to answer questions and address knowledge gaps. This IRB member says, quote, the consent advocate or monitor or whatever you want to call it. I think that's something that really helps the families, and families have to come forward and say, geez, I don't quite understand what you're asking me something. So we should make sure that families have a consent monitor. They're not responsible for giving them the information. They're responsible to go back to the patient, to the physician and say, this family mentioned they wanted to understand a little bit more about this. I think that can be a big help as well, end quote. While many parents express deep appreciation to their clinicians to help them understand the risks and potential for benefits, some affirmed a similar desire for a neutral party to guide guidance. I want to quote, I want a couple of people who are completely disinterested, who have no stake whatsoever, who are not going to administer the medication or the gene therapy delivery or whatever, who have not developed anything at all, to just say, what do you think? And bring in people who've done other similar types of treatments, however rare, and get their opinion as to the upside and the downside. This need for a disinterested party extended to financial interests. One clinical geneticist suggested that the need to ensure the quote, financial transparency of the person. Is this an investigator or a pharma? Does the investigator have significant financial interests? The families really want to know that. Why me? Why are you approaching me? And where are you coming from? And all of this. Do you have significant financial gain? Is it like fame and glory from your end? And my kid is just like a guinea pig and you just wanted to try it on somebody. I think those would be really important, end quote. So just to wrap up, in reflecting on these perspectives from our data, it suggests several points to consider when we think about these emerging interventions. The first is thinking through the research therapy spectrum and why it matters. When activities are tipped into the category of research, we know that it ushers in infrastructure, resources, and legitimacy. Determining whether activities are research or treatment has downstream implications for all actors involved. And the designation of research creates funding, oversight, professional currency. It also creates expectations, competing interests, and different metrics of success. And so research and designations in terms of when research becomes therapy, when therapy becomes research, becomes increasingly important. Another set of considerations is that N of 1 interventions require a tailored consent process. N of 1 studies should incorporate a family-centered approach, and that the broader calculus of suffering that we have been hearing through our stakeholders should be considered as part of that approach, engaging parents' assessment of risks and benefits, and understanding that this is always done in the context of their child's health trajectory will be important. Acknowledging not only the interests of the child, but also the family impact on parental decision-making is important in thinking through their own calculus of suffering and how they may be considering the family unit as a whole. Contextual factors such as the burden of caretaking and social bias against cognitive disabilities weighed heavily on parents' consideration of their child's participation in studies, and our findings suggest that the psychosocial needs of families must be addressed in the consent process, and that they must be engaged in terms of their specific concerns. To address some of this is the need for neutral navigators. All participants emphasized the importance of transparency of information in the consent process that clearly identified the risks and benefits of the procedures, but also having an individual that is free from scientific, professional, and financial interests to help shepherd patients and parents through that consent process. And I'm just going to end by acknowledging our team that is multi-institutional, multidisciplinary, and our support from NHGRI. And so I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Sandra. I love that term, calculus of suffering. It's very evocative. I think, why don't we move directly into our panel discussion now? That was scheduled for 12:25, but I think we can take questions for everyone if that's okay with you, Sandra.
That's terrific. Yeah, no, that sounds great.
Okay.